Hello, welcome to Prophecy Pod Radio. Today I'm going to take a brief look at the two witnesses of Revelation and how we can determine a little bit about the timing of the rapture from their ministry. Now, the question I want to investigate today is, when will the ministry of the two witnesses begin? Will it begin during the first half of the tribulation, or will it begin in the second half of the tribulation? Now, dispensational students of Bible prophecy believe that there will be a tribulation period of 7 years prior to the second coming of Jesus Christ. One of the things that's taught in Revelation is that during this time, God uses two witnesses to preach Jesus Christ. But as I said, the question I'm looking at today is, when will the ministry of the two witnesses begin? And when we answer this question, we find that it points to the timing of the rapture. Now, the 7-year tribulation period comes from the prophecy of the 77s of Daniel in Daniel 9, where each 7 is a period of 7 years. The tribulation period is the last or the 70th 7 of that prophecy, and that last prophetic 7 is divided into two halves, and each is 3.5 years long, and this teaching comes from Daniel 9:27. Now, we need to understand that those years are not our current calendar years of 365.25 days a year, but they are Jewish lunar years of 360 days. So each month is exactly 30 days, and each half of the tribulation is 1,260 days in length, and that is how long the ministry of the two witnesses is. In Revelation 11:3 we read, "And I will give power to my two witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days clothed in sackcloth." We know from Revelation 11:4 that these are the two olive trees and the two lampstands that stand before the Lord, and this corresponds to a prophecy given to the Jewish people in Zechariah 4:11-14. The verse in Revelation 11:4 connects these two passages, so I suspect that during the tribulation, the Jewish people will recognize that the two witnesses are the anointed ones that Zechariah prophesied about. Now, as we consider what part of the 7-year tribulation period the ministry of the two witnesses will happen in, there are those who believe it will take place during the last 3.5 years of the tribulation, based on 11:3-13, which describes the ministry of the two witnesses, and that passage is between the second and third woe. But if we look at this carefully, we'll see that the 1,260 days of the two witnesses' ministry cannot possibly be located in the second half of the tribulation. First, we need to understand that God's numbers in Revelation are literal, and God says the ministry of the two witnesses will last 1,260 days, so we know that it won't be more than that and it won't be less than that. But as we look at these time figures in Revelation, we see them expressed differently, but they are all saying the same thing. So we may read about time, times, and half a time, as in Daniel 7:25, which says, "He shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and law. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time, and times, and half a time." And we see the same phrase in Revelation 12:14, which says, "But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place, where she is nourished for a time, and times, and half a time, from the presence of the serpent." But that phrase is defined for us just a few verses earlier in Revelation 12:6. "Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, that they should feed her there for 1,260 days. So from this we know from the Bible that time, times, and half a time is the same as 1,260 days. We saw that the length of the Antichrist reign in Daniel 7:25, and that was expressed as time, times, and half a time. And his reign is spoken of again in Revelation 13:5, but this time it is phrased as 42 months. And he was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and he was given authority to continue for 42 months. By this we know that the reign of the Antichrist in Revelation 13:5 of 42 months is exactly 1,260 days. And in Daniel 9:27, we find the Antichrist committing the abomination of desolation, which is when the Antichrist will enter the temple of God and declare himself to be God and demand to be worshipped as God, and at that time he will put a stop to Jewish sacrifices and worship, which, by the way, points to a rebuilt temple in Jerusalem. In 2 Thessalonians 2:4, we read, "Who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God." Now, we know from Daniel 9:27 that this takes place in the middle of the tribulation period. But in the middle of the 7, which equals 7 lunar years, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate. Now, the abomination of desolation makes God's temple desolate. After this, Antichrist will continue in power until he is destroyed by Christ at the second coming, which we also see in Daniel 9:27. And on the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. Now, from these passages we know that the Antichrist will be destroyed on exactly the 1,260th day of his reign. We see the destruction of the Antichrist in Revelation 19:20 when Christ returns to earth. At that time the Antichrist and the false prophet will be thrown alive into the lake of fire. So from this we can learn a lot about the timing of the ministry of the two witnesses. In Revelation 11, after learning of the ministry of the two witnesses, we discover that when they have finished their testimony, the beast that comes up out of the abyss will make war with them and overcome them and kill them. That's Revelation 11:7. We are also told in Revelation 11:9 that their bodies will lie in the streets of Jerusalem for 3.5 days, and Revelation goes on to say in verse 11 that after the 3.5 days, the breath of life from God will come into them, and they will stand on their feet, and great fear will fall on all those who are watching them. Now, for demonstration purposes only, I'm going to assume the ministry of the two witnesses takes place during the last half of the tribulation period. So I'm going to let the logic of that play out. Now, at the midpoint of the tribulation, the Antichrist commits the abomination of desolation. And at the exact same time, the ministry of the two witnesses begins. They minister for the prophesied 1,260 days, which is also the exact length of the reign of the Antichrist. Now, on the final day of the reign of the Antichrist, he kills the two witnesses. However, Jesus comes back right then, and he has the Antichrist and false prophet thrown into the lake of fire. Now, even though Christ has returned to set up his kingdom, and is judging the nations, we're supposed to believe that the world watches the bodies of the two witnesses for 3.5 more days, celebrating that they are gone, and giving each other gifts, but all the while Christ has returned, has defeated the Antichrist, and is judging the nations. But looking back at the timeline, if the ministry of the two witnesses is during the last half, the problems only get worse. For after the 3.5 days, the bodies are resurrected, and there's a great earthquake. Then in Revelation 11, the third woe occurs, and the 7th trumpet is blown by the next angel, and after that the 7 bowl judgments begin. And all while Christ is present on the earth setting up his millennial reign. So if you place their ministry in the second half of the tribulation, all of this is happening 3.5 days after the second coming. So I'm sure you can see the problem with this. This is a huge problem. It's simply a fact that the judgments of Revelation are all completed before the second coming of Christ. The time of the witnesses' ministry cannot be in the second half of the tribulation. So we see here that the account of Revelation of the two witnesses comes at the end of their ministry and not at the beginning of their ministry. It's not reasonable to imagine that Christ has returned to earth as King of Kings and Lord of Lords and is allowing all of this to happen. So I just don't think it's possible that their ministry is in the second half of the tribulation. Now, the more logical assumption is that the ministry of the two witnesses takes place in the first 3.5 years of the tribulation, and that it begins on the very first day of the tribulation's 7-year period, and then ends on day 1260, when the Antichrist commits the abomination of desolation and begins his 1260-day reign. Because if the witnesses were still present, I just don't think they would allow the Antichrist to commit the abomination of desolation. Now, when we look at the fact that the ministry of the two witnesses cannot logically be in the second half of the tribulation, we can also see the logic of the rapture having already taken place before the tribulation begins. Now, from Revelation 7, we know that the 144,000 Jewish men from the 12 tribes of Israel have been sealed by God and commissioned to preach Christ at the start of the tribulation period, which begins with the first trumpet, in my opinion. So, if the church is still on earth, why have they not been sealed? We know that the church is commissioned by Christ to be his witnesses on earth, but now we see that God has commissioned 144,000 Jewish converts, as well as the two witnesses, to declare Christ to the nations. If the church was still present on earth as Christ's witnesses, why would this even be necessary? Taking the gospel of Christ to the nations has been the job of the church, for 2,000 years. But if the rapture has already taken place and the church is gone, then billions of people will have no hope in the tribulation period. Therefore, God has now ordained these two witnesses and the 144,000 to continue the work that was once done by the church. So, by having the ministry of the two witnesses in the first half of the tribulation, and through them most likely bringing the 144,000 to faith, people will still be hearing of salvation in Christ, even though the church is no longer the ones commissioned with that work of God. One issue people have with the timing of the witnesses is that their ministry is not even brought up until the end of the ministry. It's logical to infer that the 144,000 converts are converted by the two witnesses, or perhaps they're part of the 144,000, and the 144,000 are sealed before the trumpet judgments, which is another fact that leads me to believe their ministry is at the start of the tribulation period. It's certainly not beginning when they are first mentioned in Revelation 11. That is where their ministry ends, not begins. Now, I will look at Revelation and the rapture in great detail in my next video, and that will be called A Discussion of the Seven Seals of Revelation, the Timing of the Rapture, in Matthew 24. So I hope you will look for that. Well, that's all I have for today, and once again I'd like to thank you for listening to Prophecy Pod Radio, and I hope you will join me next time.